Hey everybody, welcome to this video. We are diving back into the automated trading system. So for those who don't know, we launched a version of this back in 2020. That's actually the kind of architecture sketch we're looking at right now, and made improvements to that system, launched a new version just last year, and then found issues with this system and reiterated and launched a new version just a few days ago. And what I want to do in this video is kind of focus on the building blocks. So some future videos are going to get into talking about the architecture of the system as a whole. But as we can see down here, there's a lot of interaction with the Gemini Exchange API. And this is something that's going to be consistent across all versions of this bot. And if you were interested yourself in playing with this data, trying to do it, better than I do it, build your own system or just have some fun getting this kind of data and playing around with it, that's what we're going to cover in this video. So let's start out by taking a look at this core building block. What we're going to tackle in this video is really conceptually really simple. You're going to make an API request to this exchange that has data about the prices of, in this case, cryptocurrencies, but this would apply as well for stocks or any other kind of priced asset that has an API. And then we're going to get a payload back from that system, and we're going to, in my case, I'm using Python, so we're going to apply some transformations to that data, some really basic transformations, things like taking an integer timestamp and converting that into what you would see over here as a date. And then you have your price data. So once you have that price data, you could do things with it. Something we're going to get into in future videos is how this price data ends up being set up on a schedule. So we would, fetching the price data ends up being set on a schedule. So we'd go out there, we'd say, hey, Google Cloud, I want you to execute this code once every day. This becomes some kind of, relatively simple ETL job where it extracts the data from the exchange, processes it a bit, so transforms it, and then loads it into our own database that we control. In this case, a BigQuery database. And that's going to end up allowing us to build up some historical data, because as we're going to see in the demonstration we do today, if you only implement this workflow, you're getting price data, but you're only getting price data for the recent history that the API is going to fetch for you. So for example, if you're fetching data at the 1 minute time interval, you're going to be getting approximately 1 day's worth of data. So then if you fetch data 3 days from now, you're not going to have any context about what was going on today or at any point previous in history. So in order for you to maintain that context, you just kind of have to build your own system where at some regular time interval, you are executing some code to run, processing the data that you need, and then loading it into some long-time storage. All right, so let's hit the building blocks. The very first thing that we're going to see, if we scroll over here to this first column that's kind of describing if you wanted to hit certain milestones for building a trading system, you want to know what API endpoints that you need to hit, and then you want to build an API client so that you can easily tap into that, make use of that API to get the data that you need. Looks like I doubled up on that. It's so important, we named it twice. Then you're going to build some logic around what you're extracting in that price data. For example, that conversion of timestamps as integers into dates, any other kind of stuff that you want to do, you could just build that logic in here. And then you'll have some raw data. And in our system, we end up plugging that into a pandas data frame, and then using that pandas data frame, we might just output that data to a CSV so that some kind of tool like Tableau could connect to it and we could play around with the data. Or once it's in that pandas data frame, you might start visualizing the data using a data visualization library like Seaborn or Matplotlib. Or you might, as the system does, end up taking that data frame and writing its contents to a BigQuery table. So really this first column here is what we're touching on today. So having said all of that, let's take a look at this, this code and just kind of run through what this looks like in practice. So we can see a little preview of what's going to happen. So the system that's running, it actually makes use of this. We have a module in this, in the project that I built here called features. And one of the things that features is going to do, it's going to allow us to derive some basic prices. You can pass into this function symbol and a time frame, and this is going to be a symbol that's active on the exchange and then a time frame that's available on the exchange. And if we run this, we're going to see that we get some data back. This is, like I said, since we're querying the 1 minute time interval, this is going to just be giving us data for really like the last 24 hours. Okay, so behind the scenes of this, we can kind of dissect, if you were building this, you know, this is kind of the finish line of getting data into a data frame so we could do something with it, whether that's visualizing it or storing it somewhere. So what's going on behind the scenes is that we're making use of various other little helper functions and ultimately the Gemini Exchange. And so let's kind of pull the thread here, and we can see that function that we used up above, it makes use of this function, which I just grabbed from wherever it exists in my project, and I duplicated the code here so we can kind of see it. And this is going to be transforming our data, like I said we might want to do, for example, converting our timestamp from some integer value into like an actual date that makes sense, into a date time value. And so that's one function that's helping us. And we can see now this function calls on another function behind the scenes, get prices for symbol. And get prices for symbols a little bit more simple. It doesn't yet apply the transforms that we see up here. So we're just kind of pulling the thread, and we're seeing that, you know, this function that's used in the ultimate flow out here, where we're going to be, let's zoom out, find ourselves. We're going to be calling on the Exchange API. We're going to be getting some raw data back. We're going to be transforming it in some way, and then we ultimately get to the data that we want. So we can keep following this thread. Okay, so this function makes use of some other function that's getting prices data. We see down here that that prices data is the building blocks for what we ultimately want, but it comes in a little bit more raw form. But even this one has something behind it. So behind the scenes of this function, we're going to be having a more basic interaction with the API. So I wanted to show you this kind of step-by-step pulling the thread, because this is really, you know, once you get to the point where you're building a full-scale system, like what we're going to be talking about in some future videos, you know, there's going to be a lot of complexity, things going on that you don't always need to worry about. So we figure out some logic that gets us where we need to be, and then we just kind of abstract that away. So we can just call on this thing that gets us the next building block and gets it for us really easily. So you don't always have to do a bunch of complex logic to get where we want to be. We figure it out once, we put that code away, and then we call on it. All right, so dissecting this get price data for symbol, what is this doing? This is where we're actually going to be interacting with the REST API. So this is going to be calling on a specific endpoint. We'll take a look at how we know what this endpoint is, and how we know what information we need to provide when we're hitting that endpoint, and also how we know what that endpoint's going to give back to us. So let's go out, let's take a look at what's going on with this endpoint. Here we are at the Gemini Exchange REST API documentation. If you just Google REST API, Gemini Exchange, you would land here. And we can scroll on down. We can see that there's these public APIs where you don't need an account or anything. You can just get this data from their systems. And the one that we are hitting out here is the candles endpoint. Okay, so if we go down to candles, you can see that this gives us a kind of preview of what this API would, what calling on this endpoint would return to you. And this is just one of those timestamps in that integer format, giving you the milliseconds. Then you have some numbers coming through, and we can know what these numbers are by just scrolling down a little bit more, reading the description of what this endpoint's doing. So we're getting back that time in milliseconds, we're getting back an open price, and various other prices and volume information for what was going on for that symbol over whatever time frame we're querying. So these are also the valid time frames. We are, in our example, we're querying the 1 minute granularity. You can also query 5 minute all the way down to a day, but you have to be hitting one of these in order for it to be valid. All right, so let's see what this looks like out here in practice. We have our get price data for symbol, and we're calling on that endpoint. So we can just define this function, but rather than calling on this function, let's just play this out manually. So if you really want to get to know how this stuff works, you can just plug in the request directly, and let's see what the raw information we're getting from the API looks like. So we'll say sample response equals whatever the requests library gives us when we issued this the request to get whatever's behind this endpoint. So we'll run this, we'll see sample response comes back. If we just output this, it says response 200. So it's showing us the status code. This is actually the status code. And 200 means that the request was successful. But if we want to see the values that were returned, we could call on the JSON body of that response. So let's do that, sample response.json, and now we can see something that's kind of corresponding to, or it's kind of showing us the same output as what we know that we should expect to receive. Okay, that's good. And now we can go a little bit further. So in this whole system design up here, the really basic flow of getting this data and putting it into a pandas data frame, so we could do something with that price data. Well, we've hit the API request. We've issued that API request against Gemini Exchange. We've gotten our JSON payload back. And now we want to do some Python transformations. Okay, so let's hop back into our code over here, and we could say, well, first thing I want to do is get this data into a pandas data frame so I can do these transformations. So what that looks like is we need to identify what all these column names are. So we know that we're always going to be getting this information in a specific order, and that order happens to be the same order that these columns are named right here. So we can just go back out and define a list of all those column names, and then we're going to make use of the pandas library to take the contents we got from the API, grab that data in JSON format, and then make sure that we give all of the columns the appropriate name, and then that's going to create this pandas data frame for us. So we can go ahead and do that, and we can preview what this looks like. And now we're in this situation where we've written this code from scratch that goes out to the API, grabs this data, puts it into a pandas data frame. And from here, it would just be a matter of you deciding what kinds of transformations you would like to apply in order to get to this, this kind of output here. So in my case, I go ahead and have this function be the thing that I'm running every day as my ETL process, because I like to just work with the time in more of a string format. I actually store it as well with timestamps, but whenever I'm interacting with this data and doing exploratory analysis, I always end up wanting to convert it into something like this. So it's nice to just go ahead and package that logic in a nice, easy, callable thing like this to make it all happen. So without trying to cover too much ground in one video, I guess we'll just say that we've covered the aspects here of fetching the price data, which is really the core building block to any system that you're going to be building based on automatically retrieving price data, seeing what is the context of the price right now, and then making decisions on would you like to buy or sell. Okay, so next time we're going to cover a little bit more of what we could do to automate this. What does that actually look like? Sounds really complex, but well, if you've never done this stuff before, you're working with cloud infrastructure, Google Cloud, how do you even get started? But once you know which hoops you need to jump through, it all becomes quite achievable. So we'll cover this in the next video, and then we'll get rolling with explaining what was going on in the first iteration of this bot. How did we evolve that into version 2? What's different now in version 2.1? And what were some of these learnings from each stage that drove the decisions into the next evolution? All right, so hopefully this was interesting to you, and we'll be coming back with more details very soon. So thanks for tuning in.